This week in lab, we're going to learn the rest of the bones of the skeleton. This is called the axial skeleton. And the axial skeleton is the part of the skeleton that things with arms and legs share with things like fish that don't have arms and legs, okay? But both of us, we have the axial skeleton. So remember to reference your lab manual. We're going to start off on page 51. Page 51 is all of the detail about the structure of bones, and some of it overlaps with lectures you've probably already seen from the lecture portion of the class. Then page 52 and the very top of page 53, that's going to be mostly bones of your skull and jaw, right? And then the rest of page 53 are bones of the torso. So ribs, sternum, and backbones. Alrighty, let's get going. So let's start off with the parts of the bone. This is something that you should already know from the lecture part of the class, but every long bone, bones like your finger bones or your forearm bones, your humerus, these are known as long bones. And long bones have two different ends, and each end is called an epiphysis. And the epiphysis that's closer to the torso is the proximal one. The epiphysis that's farther away is the distal one. In between what you might refer to as the shaft of the bone, that is known as the diaphysis. The diaphysis. Now, bones are made out of two kinds of bone tissue. So if I ever ask you what kind of bone tissue is this, you got a 50-50 chance, as long as you remember there are only two kinds of bone tissue. And the two kinds of bone tissue are compact bone, and compact bone almost looks like plastic. If you were handling these bones in the lab, they would feel quite a bit like plastic to you. That's the compact bone. Compact bone is very, very dense, quite heavy though. So we only use a certain amount of compact bone. The rest of the bone is either a space, we'll get to that in a second, or it is spongy bone. Spongy bone has got other names like trabecular bone and cancella's bone. Let's just call it spongy bone. I want to emphasize this to you. All of the bone that has the appearance of a sponge, all of it is called spongy bone. Because actually, on this particular image in your textbook, and probably also on the lecture PowerPoints, this area right here is labeled space for red marrow. Well, spongy bone is where the red marrow that gives birth to your blood cells lives. So all those little spaces in between the spongy bone bits, that's where your red marrow would live. That is true. But it is also true that it looks like a sponge and it is spongy bone, right? What else do we need to know? We need to know that at the ends of the bones, or at the different epiphyses, where there is a joint, like here is the ball of the hip that will go into the acetabulum of the pelvis, right? There is going to be articular cartilage. I'm looking at page 51 to make sure I cover all the points you need to know. Medullary cavity. This empty space in the middle of the diaphysis is called the medullary cavity. And the medullary cavity has got big blood vessels in it. And it also is a place where we will store fat, a special kind of fat that's called yellow marrow. The epiphyseal line. So right here and right there, the textbook has labeled these epiphyseal plates. This is AP 120. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail with you about the difference between an epiphyseal plate and an epiphyseal line. But if you go on to 150, they may make that point. The epiphyseal plate, that is while you're still growing. And this bone that they're showing us here, this person has stopped growing. The epiphyseal line, that is this little scar of bone when you're done growing. Okay, so luckily for you, for my quizzes and my exams in AP 120, I accept both answers. Endosteum and periosteum. You can actually draw a nice little pencil line through endosteum. I'm not going to ask you that. I will ask you periosteum. Okay, the periosteum is this connective tissue layer, and this connective tissue it's connective tissue, kind of like a real tough saran wrap that is shrink wrapped onto the outside of the bone. The periosteum is the way that your bones will grow in thickness as you're growing. Okay, all right, that's it for the parts of the bone. Let's look at the histology of compact bone. And again, this is covered in more detail in lecture. And in lecture, I explain to you not just the names of these things, but also like what they're doing. So you may want to refer to that if you haven't already seen it. All right, let's start with one, the osteon. The osteon is the name of this whole structure. Now, this whole structure, do I have another picture? No, I don't. We're looking down on something that looks kind of like a tree that's been chopped down, and you're looking at the rings on the tree. By the way, the rings on the tree are known as lamellae. So that is a lamella, right? And that is a lamella, okay? These rings are called lamellae. I'm sorry. Rings are called lamellae. And like a tree, this is not, it didn't grow as a stump. This whole thing looks like a stump when you're looking at the model, but it's actually a big old long tree. It's a very long column that makes up the substance of the compact bone that's here in your diaphysis. So running the length are these little columns, little, microscopically small, okay? So super tiny. And this is one of them. So each one of these columns that makes up the structure of your compact bone is called an osteon. And the reason there are osteons is that bone tissue has got a really large amount of this calcium phosphorus soaked matrix that is very hard, and oxygen and glucose needs to get from the little artery here all the way out to that cell out there. And the way that bone can do that and keep all of those cells alive is to organize it in these osteons. This area right here in the center is called the central canal. And the central canal has got an artery and a vein and a lymphatic and a nerve. You don't need to know that part, okay? The whole thing is the osteon, central canal, lamella we know. Okay, lacuna and osteocytes. Let me be clear. If this particular model were sitting in front of you on your table, you would notice that these things right here and here and here and that guy and that guy and that guy, that those things are little holes. They're little holes in the hard matrix that makes up the non-living part of every bone. If you found a bone laying on the side of the road because someone chucked it out after eating chicken or something like that, those cells are all dead now. But what remains is all of this stuff that's depicted here in this kind of beige color. Okay, so there are holes in that hard bone stuff, and the holes in the large hard bone stuff are called lacunae. And lacunae are the little caves that the osteocytes live in. The osteocytes are depicted here as red with blue nuclei. That's an osteocyte. Where does it live? It lives in one of these lacunae. Canaliculi. The way oxygen gets from here all the way down to there is it gets handed from here to there, and then he hands it to his pal, he hands it to his pal, he hands it to his pal, who hands it to his pal, who hands it to that cell. okay? And how do they do that? They've got their skinny little osteocyte arms reaching through little canals that are called canaliculi, right? Now you know everything about that. Let's talk just a little bit about cartilage. Just as osteocytes, which means bone cell, by the way, just as osteocytes live in lacunae and they have this very rigid matrix. Oh, this is very good. Okay, nice picture. Okay, cartilage cells are called chondrocytes. Osteocyte for bone cell, chondrocyte for cartilage cell. They also live in lacuna, and the lacuna are the little spaces inside of the matrix that makes up the structure of cartilage. And in previous semesters on the lab midterm, there's been this picture that asks you what kind of tissue this is. Well, that's pretty easy because you only have to learn 2 tissues in AP 120. So you only have to learn what bone tissue looks like and what cartilage looks like. So you should be able to do that. Bone tissue is going to look like osteons, very organized, got noticeable rings. Cartilage has got either a blue or a purple matrix, and it has lacunae, but it doesn't have that structure of the lamellae. All right, let's turn to page 52. Now we are starting to talk about the bones of the skull, and I'm going to start that on the next video.